Hello, welcome to Raja Reads. I'm Masood Raja, and today in my series on academic and scholarly books, I would like to introduce you to a very important book about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or situation, and that is the Israel-Palestine Conflict by James Gelvin. Israel-Palestine Conflict by James Gelvin. Now, one of the reasons, of course, is because this is one of the most significant conflictual zones in the world, right? Both related to the state of Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But also the obvious immediate reason is because the new conflict between the state of Israel and Gaza has just escalated to almost like a war-like situation. And I think it is important for all of us to at least figure out, what are the roots of this conflict? Are there any possibilities of change or resolution? And for that, we need some really good historical work of some integrity. Obviously, we can't just rely on YouTube and internet to know this. So I find Paul Gelvin's work really useful in so many ways. I had reviewed this book for a journal. And in my review, I had mentioned that one thing that I found really compelling about this book, and it was published by Cambridge University Press, and it covers only from the beginning of the conflict in 1947 till post-Oslo 1996. That's the period that it covers, even the new edition. But it's published by Cambridge University Press, which is one of the most prestigious academic presses. So if you really want a reliable book by a really respected Middle Eastern scholar, that is James Gelvin, published by a very established academic press, this is the book you want. What impressed me about the book was also that it doesn't just tell a one-sided story. It doesn't just tell the Palestinian side of the story, or it is not biased towards Israel. It takes both entities, the state of Israel and its citizens, and the Palestinian, as two pre-constituted entities. What do I mean by that? Pre-constituted in a sense that it doesn't consider the point that Israeli citizens are citizens of a legitimate state, that Palestinians do exist and have a name, have a territory. It takes them as two competing nations which unleash their own specific national ideologies. So that's a very important thing in Middle Eastern scholarship, because if you read some biased accounts, you will see that one side either privileges Israelis or Palestinians at the cost of one or the other. This is not a biased account. So if you read the book, you will learn about the history of the land and its people, then the history of Palestinians, as well as the history of Jewish citizens of State of Israel. And then contemporary politics all the way up to Oslo Accords. Major wars are covered, major conflicts are covered, and also the local politics, both on the Palestinian side and Israeli side, are also covered. So that's why this is one of the most comprehensive books, in my opinion, in understanding state of Israel, Palestine, and the conflict between the two. Now, the way it is organized is there is one chapter that just basically gives us a history of the land itself, the Levant, of which the Palestinian territories and the entire territory used to be called Palestine. So, and then cultures of nationalism is another chapter which tells us how the idea, national identities on the Israeli side and Palestinian side has developed over the history. And especially the Palestinian identity and its connection to Al-Naqaba, right? Or 1947, the destruction when the State of Israel was created. What is the symbolic significance of that? Then it also has a whole chapter on Zionism and the colonization of Palestine by the Zionist movement. How did they acquire land? How did they populate it? That history is really crucial in understanding it. And from nationalism in Palestine to Palestinian nationalism, that's chapter 5, it gives us a good philosophical and historical account of the rise of Palestinian nationalism. How is it that Palestinians start seeing themselves as Palestinians and not just as Arabs? And then the final chapter, it leaves us at the conclusion of the 1996 invasion of Hezbollah, the militant organization in Lebanon, by State of Israel, and that how the history has come full circle. So overall, in my opinion, if you want to read one book that gives you a clear understanding of the politics, the history, and the philosophies that underwrite the Palestinian national identity and the Israeli national identity, with specific details about how do the Israelis control their territories, what do the Palestinians do, how they eventually end up meeting for the Oslo Accords, which are never fulfilled. If you want to study and learn the basic lineaments of the politics of both these constituencies, the Israelis and the Palestinians, this is the book that I would highly encourage you to pick up and read during this time. My hope is that after you've read this book, your understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will not be one-sided. I mean, if you read it openly, while you will learn about the conflict and its history and its colonial history, you will also learn the narratives mobilized by both sides, but also believed by both sides. And chances are that after you've read this book, the Palestinians would not just be this one unknown group to you. They will come alive to you as living, breathing people who constitute a nation. And very few books in Middle Eastern studies, especially published in United States and Europe, actually do that. Right? Most books, especially by conservative scholars, tend to silence the Palestinian voices. And I think this book does that very clearly. The only other book that compares in its explanation of the rise of Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian identity, of course, is Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, which was published in the 1970s. At that time, no one even admitted that they were Palestinian people. They were just called Arabs. So if you really want to read the history of the Palestinian people as written by a Palestinian scholar with exceptional research and scholarship, I would highly recommend that book too. But for right now, if you're curious, want to know more in detail with impeccable scholarship about the nature, the history, the politics of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Paul Gelvin's The Israel-Palestine Conflict, 100 Years of War, is a book that I highly recommend. So if you need a book of erudite scholarship, which in one volume can teach you about the history of the rise of the Zionist movement, the rise of the Israeli state, its establishment, its policies, its conflicts within the region, and the impact of its policies on its own citizens, but also on Palestinians, this is the book. Similarly, if you need a book that gives you a really well-researched account of the rise of Palestinian nationalism, an account of Palestinian views of Israel, their grievances, their internal divisions, this is the book. Also, if you also want to learn a little more about Israel's conflicts with Hezbollah and with other regional Arab nations, this book does a great job of informing you about that. And that is why I highly recommend it. I do hope you pick it up and read it. And if you do, let me know what you think, or especially What did it teach you that you weren't aware of? But I highly recommend this book, especially under the current new emerging crisis in Israel and Palestine. So that's all I have to share today. I hope this is useful to you. I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, stay safe, take care of each other, and I will now see you next time. Please take a few moments to subscribe to the channel so that you get timely notifications of whatever new videos are posted. Until then, and until I see you next time, peace and love.